In fact, the word criticism itself is related to the act of separating or eliminating. That is, it means distinguishing the good from the bad, and it doesn't just mean saying negative things. There is a verse about those who get married. Do these verses have to mean anything to a single person? For example, what do you understand from this verse? Therefore, what I call universality is a bit misunderstood. I mean, the fact that the Quran is compiled between two covers, that we read it regularly, and that we believe in all of it, does not mean that we always have a context in which we can understand all of it. If we believe that what is before us is revelation, we should treat it as revelation. But if we consider it as a human text, then we should act accordingly. But you can't have both at the same time, for example. In other words, you can't believe that something comes from a divine source and is also a human product. Let's answer this by starting from a broader perspective. For example, it is often thought that there is a tension between religion and criticism. And indeed, from time to time, we can sense this tension. We can feel it, for instance, on a sociological level. For example, conservatism emerges, innovation emerges, reformists appear, and so on. In other words, we see that such things exist in different religious traditions, in different religious cultures. And then there is also the idea that religion as a whole is a tradition, and science or modern thought, or unfortunately philosophy, are seen as something new, as reform. In other words, religion is generally considered outdated. So there is this notion that we should move on to something new. Now, as I said, if we take a step back and look at it from a broader perspective, actually, this tension between religion and critical thinking, to us, it's as if religion, it has never changed, and from the impression that critical thinking also tries to change it. It's coming. I especially want to emphasize the statement that religion does not change. Now, when we say religion does not change, we mean that the texts do not change. But can there be a change in a person's own religious belief within themselves? Yes, there can be, and this does not mean that they have left the religion. How so? A belief, in the sense of maturing a person already, their religion changes, their behaviors also change. Their approach to religion changes as well. In fact, it needs to change. So a person, if what is meant by a person's religion not changing is to go all the way to the end just as they first believed, they need to know from the start that this is not possible. Because that's a bit of a fantastical idea. In other words, it's not something that can actually happen. Because what we call religion, the set of beliefs, within that, many things have a dynamic structure. For example, in daily life, scientific thought is not as dynamic as this. Because for it to change, a lot of procedures are required. But the changes in religious beliefs are more related to our daily needs, our own maturation, our character development, and the transformation of our identity. That's why, in this sense, religion does not have an unchanging structure either. So according to what does it change? This is the main question here. This question, let's first consider the aspect of critical thinking. What is this critical thinking? It actually has a negative connotation. When someone criticizes someone else, it ruins the mood. Yes, and we don't like to be criticized. But actually, being criticized and not wanting it is a given. Not wanting your ego, it means not wanting to get hurt. Because we attach too many things to our ego. So if being criticized makes us feel inadequate, incomplete, bad, or somehow unworthy, we become closed off to criticism as well. Then, even the slightest criticism feels like it will wound our ego, so we try to push it away. But if critical thinking helps us grow, if it allows us to see things we couldn't see ourselves, that's actually its purpose. So, critical thinking is not a negative thing, it's a positive thing. In fact, the word criticism itself is related to the idea of sifting or separating. It means distinguishing the good from the bad, and it doesn't just mean pointing out negative things. It's a tool for organizing. I mean, I can't think just by myself, only with my own mind. Therefore, let's say with the minds of others, with the perspectives of others, if I can see something, the same thing from that perspective as well. What happens then? I need this. I need your mind. You need my mind so that we can fulfill our ego. Don't end up trapped inside our own egos. Now, so what could be the relationship between this and religion? First of all, here's the noteworthy part. We see every time that especially theistic religions come with a very serious social critique. Hazrat, Moses the Prophet, Muhammad. Religion has always been a critical thing, right down to the principles it presents to society. It criticizes certain practices in that society. It criticizes certain beliefs in that society. It criticizes the social structure. And sometimes it even criticizes individuals one by one. There are verses like this in the Quran as well. Therefore, since it comes with a critical tone, that's exactly what religion is. From Pharaoh, Nimrod, Abu Jahl, or here is Haz. What are we talking about when we talk about Jews against Jesus? We are talking about them disrupting the established order. In fact, at its core, religion contains a sense of criticality. This criticality is what connects religion and critical thinking today. Between them, I think this also helps us better understand the connection.
Religion came as a criticism of any inconsistency or wrongdoing. It came as a criticism against some non-existent situations. And in fact, it came to correct certain things within society. This is how we see it. This is how we interpret it. In the era when it emerged and at the time and place it appeared, it also led to certain changes. By criticizing, it tried to organize and transform that society. But what we observe is the reason for the interpretation that religion is close to criticism is actually that religion is seen as unchanging, immutable, and in no way open to criticism. So when we take a critical look at religion here, what exactly should we be filtering out? Should we be changing or criticizing the traditional interpretations, or should we be changing and criticizing our own way of understanding?
Of course, what usually gets confused here is this. I mean, whether it's the texts related to religious sources, let it be. Of course, when I say text, I don't just mean written texts. It could also be oral. When approaching texts, we often face the problem of equating the texts themselves with their interpretations. This is the issue we encounter. Therefore, a comment for the main sources of religion, inevitably, that interpretation. For example, when it fails, or that interpretation turns out to be wrong, that interpretation changes the world. So when that interpretation, when it fails to add meaning to our lives, you end up having to direct your criticism at the religion itself. Because what you consider to be religion is actually just a certain expression, a particular style, in other words. Now, this is something that happens to us quite often. And actually, what we call interpretation is what a person understands from certain sources. In other words, no matter how learned, how wise, how sincere, or how knowledgeable someone is, their interpretation is shaped to be correct within the circumstances they are in. This applies to us as well. That is, our own interpretation today does not have the capacity to be so correct as to encompass all times. In other words, to claim this is truly problematic. But what we mean when we make such a claim is an even bigger problem. In other words, it is neither a commentary on today nor on the past. We have no right to replace religion. And for those who claim that right, for people who to label the criticisms directed at themselves or at those who adopt that interpretation as an attack on religion or a rejection of religion is also unfair. It's a great injustice, in other words.
To make this a bit more concrete, teacher, there are certain discourses, there are religious texts, there are interpretations, there are narrations, and there are hadiths. For example, if we consider the verses in the Quran in terms of our own religion or a hadith or a narration or to equate any situation that is described, an event mentioned in a religious text with the verses found in the core text of the Quran, and to perceive this as the actual religion, acting on it as the main principle without relating it to interpretation. Can we say that this actually leads to problems for those who criticize religion as well? So to establish this connection more clearly, let's try to explain it with some examples.
Of course, we need to think about it like this, including the Quran. I mean, the fact that it was revealed within a certain context brings with it a semantic integrity. We are not in a position to understand things by removing that integrity, but we need to have an awareness of how that integrity has been transformed and transmitted. We need to be aware of that. That is the text of the Quran. How was it understood? How have they been understood throughout history? This carries very important points until it reaches us, because we also do not have direct access to the source. A commentator does not have direct access to the source either. They only have something that can explain how they understood it, but how they understood it is also connected to how we understand it. Therefore, if we now say, let's put aside all the historical data and just focus on the event itself and try to understand the Quran directly, we would actually be making a methodological mistake, because we do not have transportation or accessories. We also believe within a certain context. And within this context, even the interpretations that seem wrong to us or that seem irrelevant to today are included. We need to be able to criticize those as well. In other words, we need to engage with them too. Yes, it's not an easy task. That is, when you encounter something in a text, you don't have to consider and reconstruct its specific historical context every single time. But let's say in a verse of the Quran, if you have a question about what something means, a sign of arrival, you can find the answer by considering what others have thought it meant. We can't just sit by ourselves and wait for revelation to come to us as well.
Yes. Reading religion in its historical context is actually something that is criticized. It's a somewhat controversial issue. For example, when we look at the period when the Quran was revealed, when the religion came, we're talking about a time when the system of slavery existed, and it progressed with verses and transformations that were perhaps appropriate to that context. For example, right now we have wage labor. Maybe in the future that's something that will also change and transform. A time when there is no working class, for instance, we might evolve into a period where robots do all the jobs that are currently done only by workers. But in the future, looking back at today and making comments about workers would not be a very consistent thing to do. So what is the main thing we should be focusing on here? So here, look at the essence based on the context here. What is the meaning we need to find?
Let me give an example, for instance, about slavery. Actually, in this way, we can philosophically discuss the universality of the Quran a bit. We have to examine this. If what we mean by universality here is that every verse must always, if it has to mean something, then we are not in a position to achieve that. Why? Because let's say there is a verse about those who get married. Do these verses have to mean anything to a single person, for example? So what do you understand from this verse? Therefore, what we call universality here is somewhat misunderstood. That the Quran is compiled between two covers, and that we actually read it regularly and believe in all of it, does not mean that we always have a context in which we can understand all of it. For example, let me proceed from the example you gave about slavery. Now, what do the verses about slavery mean for us today? Some might say that this is something related to workers' rights or something like that. But, slavery and labor are actually not very similar things. One of them is a situation related to the laws of war. The other is about receiving compensation for one's labor. It seems that saying it like this would lead us to a more concrete piece of data. If one day society changes and slavery returns, which is not impossible, look, anything can happen, these verses will be applied again, that is to say. But if we say, let's understand this more figuratively in a society where slavery does not exist, then interpretation comes into play. I'm not saying it can't be, as I said before. This can also be considered as an interpretation. But that's all it means. We can't fall into that trap. Otherwise, we would be making the same mistake again. This time, we would be replacing the text itself with interpretation.
So, Professor, in the modern era, how should one read religious texts? What kind of methodological approach should be used? So should one consider this historical context, acknowledge that there is a background here, that there could be other meanings? Should one keep this in mind? But how can one benefit from these? How can one reflect this into daily life?
So I naturally use a method I am not in a position to suggest. It's not very feasible, both due to my philosophical training and also because of this, this is what needs to be done. It's not possible for one person to devise a method broad enough for what needs to be done here. But I can only say this. So as someone who tries to understand the Quran or tries to shape their life according to the hadiths, if I were to evaluate this as a philosopher, by reflecting on a certain number of specific verses or a particular hadith, progressing slowly, digesting it gradually, rather than trying to extract a holistic meaning from the entire Quran and derive some universal principles from all of it. It leads us to a much more solid place than trying to act according to universal principles. Otherwise, we end up getting caught up in a somewhat fantastical construct, trying to maintain that sense of wholeness. We really don't see this either among the companions or in the generations that came after them. We can see the effort. What truly matters are certain verses or certain religious texts to progress as we understand them, to transform our lives, to reflect upon them, and to let them guide our lives. This may not be possible for our entire lives to understand or apply all of them. That, of course, is also a matter of fate. And it's a matter of fate that we shouldn't force. Let's think about it this way. A significant number of the companions, that is, many of them passed away long before the completion of the prophethood. Some were martyred, some passed away. But they too died with faith. They passed away as believers. Therefore, we have no privilege over them. In other words, we do not have a different responsibility either. We need to learn as much as we can, practice as much as we are able, and sincerely strive to transform ourselves. At least, of course, as much as we are capable. Things like this also happen. For example, sometimes, well, you may not fully understand a verse you read when you were 20 years old. You know that verse, but by the time you turn 30, you have gone through very different things in your life. You've experienced becoming a different person. At that point, that verse can start to feel very meaningful to you. So you can find new meaning in it again and again. You gave it a meaning once. That stays there. Everything is according to this because there is no guarantee of that. And I hope that, in fact, what we will be questioned about is this very effort. Otherwise, actually getting it right doesn't really seem to be our job.
So it seems like finding the difference in the same thing. Professor? Well, if I may return to those religious texts, Professor, it seems that the unity of interpretation in these religious texts is also something that holds society together. I mean, traditional interpretations, they actually turn into something that the whole society believes in together, and it also becomes a source of social unity. To criticize the interpretations here, to set them aside, how does that gradually change the spiritual unity of society?
If these criticisms are based on certain metaphysical fundamental premises, and if in these premises if they are principles that do not align with our articles of faith, of course there will be conflict. And we can see the harm in this way. That is, interpretations that have emerged with conflicting or contradictory assumptions. We are faced with their bluntness. In other words, if we believe what is before us is revelation, we should treat it as revelation. But if we consider it as a human text, then we should treat it accordingly. But you can't have both at the same time, for example. In other words, you can't believe in something that comes from a divine source and at the same time is a human product. Therefore, you have to believe according to one of them. Now, actually here, at the point you mentioned, perhaps what needs to be done socially is to do what is necessary to be able to give meaning, to establish that context together. How can this be done? Well, by reading the Quran together, or clear, by trying to understand certain verses together as we read them, and during this exchange, by making our hearts as open to this as possible. Because truly, I say this especially based on some of the debates in our country. Debates over the meaning of Quranic verses don't really benefit either believers or non-believers much. I mean, people use these as a basis for certain, they are spinning social media debates and television debates. But honestly, for most of them, the showmanship outweighs the substance. No matter how much you argue, after a while, the debate itself appetite. It overshadows the meaning of the verses and the whole thing becomes meaningless. On the contrary, I think it would be more appropriate to do the following. We should be able to say Allah knows best. In other words, we shouldn't be making such grand claims. We don't have a definitive text in our hands. This text is full of verses, in other words, full of passages that point to the truth. And we believe not in the signs themselves, but in what they point to. We do. We have to interpret those verses to understand what they are pointing to. How else are we supposed to understand? By interpreting and talking with each other. And by talking with each other, I don't just mean having a conversation face to face. We need to constantly enrich ourselves by reading the book, by reading past books, by reading today's interpretations. There is no other way, really.
For the rest, we will say Allah knows best.
We need to say Allah knows best, in other words. We need to have the courage to do this.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. Thank you. We tried to build a critical bridge between tradition and interpretation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dear viewers, we talked about the relationship between religion, texts, and critical thinking today. See you in the next episode. Goodbye.